My mother watched a man rip our wheelchair ramp permit off the front door while she sat just a few feet away behind the living room window. He smiled, like he'd just protected the neighborhood from some terrible threat, then tucked the torn paper under his arm, and told me our street wasn't the place for that kind of construction. What he didn't know was that I'd spent more than a decade investigating federal civil rights cases, and the moment he opened his mouth, he unknowingly turned a petty HOA dispute into the biggest mistake of his entire life. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 39 years old, and until about a year before all this happened, I worked as a civil rights compliance investigator for a federal agency. After my father passed away, I left Washington and moved back to Cedar Ridge, a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, because my mom, Linda, couldn't manage the house alone anymore. She had lived with multiple sclerosis for years. Some days she could stand for a few seconds. Most days she couldn't, and the woman who had once hiked every state park within driving distance now measured freedom by whether the weather was dry enough for me to safely help her down 2 concrete steps. She hated depending on people. Every single time I lifted her wheelchair over those steps, she'd apologize, and every single time I'd tell her the same thing. Mom, you carried me for 18 years. I think I can handle 2 steps. She'd laugh, shake her head, and tell me I was getting dramatic in my old age. Those little conversations were our routine. But deep down I knew those stairs weren't just inconvenient anymore, they were dangerous. One rainy afternoon, her wheelchair slipped just enough to send both of us sideways, and even though I caught her before she hit the ground, I lay awake that night thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't. The next morning, I hired an accessibility contractor. We worked with the county, submitted every drawing they requested, paid every permit fee, and made sure the ramp would match the house so well most people wouldn't even notice it. The inspector approved the plans without hesitation. The concrete footings were poured. Lumber sat neatly stacked on the lawn. Every single requirement had been met. I honestly thought the hard part was over. Then one of my neighbors, an older retired firefighter named Frank, wandered over carrying a coffee mug and said, "You didn't hear this from me, but the HOA board had some kind of closed meeting last night. Folks were talking about your ramp." I laughed because I thought he was joking. Why would they care? The county already approved it. Frank just shrugged. You'd have to ask them. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to my mailbox. It wasn't from the county. It was from the HOA Architectural Committee. According to them, my approved wheelchair ramp violated community aesthetics, disrupted architectural harmony, and could negatively affect surrounding property values. I read the letter 3 times because it sounded so ridiculous that I thought I must have missed something. Then I drove straight to the HOA office. That's where I met Richard Holloway, the HOA president. Richard was the kind of man who never seemed to wrinkle his polo shirts, always carried a leather folder, and somehow managed to smile without looking friendly. Before I even finished introducing myself, he interrupted me. "Mr. Brooks, we have standards here." I held up the county permit, and the county has standards too. They approved everything. He barely looked at the paper. "The association has the final say on exterior modifications, not on accessibility accommodations," I replied. His smile tightened. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you?" That sentence caught me off guard. "You people?" I asked. He leaned closer like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "Neighborhoods like this weren't designed for medical structures. Facilities exist for a reason." I stared at him for a second because I honestly couldn't believe he'd said it out loud. Before I could answer, I heard the soft electric hum of my mother's wheelchair behind me. She had insisted on coming because she wanted to thank the board for working with us. Instead, she rolled right into the middle of that conversation. Richard looked directly at her and said, "Ma'am, I'm sure you'd be more comfortable somewhere that's designed for your situation." The hallway went completely silent. Even 2 board members standing behind him suddenly became fascinated with their clipboards. My mother didn't say anything. She simply looked down at her hands. That hurt more than anything Richard had said. I took one slow breath and asked, "Would you mind repeating that?" He smiled again. "Of course. This neighborhood isn't the place for permanent disability modifications." "One more time," I said calmly, nice and clear. He repeated every word, slower than before, almost proudly. I nodded, thanked him for his time, helped my mother back to the car, and drove home without saying another word. During the entire drive, she kept apologizing, saying maybe they were right. Maybe the ramp was asking too much. I pulled into our driveway, turned off the engine, looked at her, and said, "Mom, You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. Someone else does. She squeezed my hand but still looked heartbroken. That night, after helping her inside, I walked into my home office, opened my old laptop, unlocked a folder I hadn't touched since leaving federal service, and for the first time in over a year, I wasn't looking at family photos or retirement paperwork. I was looking at federal housing regulations, disability accommodation precedents, and investigative procedures I knew almost by heart. Richard thought he'd won because he controlled an HOA meeting. What he didn't realize was that he just handed a former federal investigator exactly what he needed to start building a case that would reach far beyond a neighborhood boardroom. I woke up the next morning before sunrise, made coffee that I barely touched, and started doing something I hadn't done in over a year, thinking like an investigator instead of a son. The hardest part wasn't understanding the law. I already knew the Fair Housing Act inside and out, and I knew exactly where the Americans with Disabilities Act intersected with housing accommodations. The hard part was reminding myself that this wasn't just another case file sitting on a government desk. Every document I opened had my mother's face attached to it. Every regulation I read reminded me of her sitting silently in that hallway, while a man in an expensive polo shirt explained why she didn't belong in the neighborhood she'd called home for 32 years. Anger is dangerous when you're building a legal case because anger makes people sloppy, and sloppy cases lose. So I forced myself to slow down. I created folders, timelines, witness lists, and evidence logs exactly the way I used to. County permits went into one folder, architectural drawings into another, inspection reports, contractor invoices, HOA correspondence. Then I reached the denial letter again and smiled for the first time in days. Richard had made one mistake that inexperienced people always make when they think they're untouchable. He'd put everything in writing, every excuse about aesthetics, every reference to property values, every claim that the association had authority to reject accessibility modifications. It was all there, neatly printed on HOA letterhead. Around lunchtime, my mom rolled into the office holding 2 sandwiches. "You've been in here for hours," she said softly. I looked up and realized she had that same worried expression she used to wear when I was studying for exams in college. "You don't have to fight every battle, Ethan," I smiled. "No, but I do have to fight this one." She looked around at the stacks of paperwork covering the desk. "I never wanted to be the reason for all this." I reached over and took her hand. "You're not the reason. You're the excuse they picked. There's a difference." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the window where the unfinished ramp sat, surrounded by construction materials that had already started collecting leaves. "Your father would have hated this," she whispered. I laughed quietly. Dad would have been at Richard's front door by now. She laughed too, and for the first time since everything started, I saw a little bit of her old spirit come back. Later that afternoon, I called Mike Jensen, the contractor. He answered on the second ring. "Ethan, I've been wondering what's going on. My crew keeps asking when we're finishing the job." I explained the HOA denial. There was silence for several seconds before Mike finally muttered, "You're kidding. I wish I was. I've built ramps for veterans, kids with cerebral palsy, accident victims. Nobody's ever tried to stop one before. Would you be willing to provide a statement?" He didn't even hesitate. "Tell me where to sign." That one phone call turned into 6 more. Frank, the retired firefighter, agreed to describe everything he'd heard about the closed HOA meeting. Our mail carrier admitted she'd overheard Richard make comments about keeping medical facilities out of the subdivision. Even one of the landscapers quietly told me Richard had been complaining for weeks that wheelchair ramps made neighborhoods look old. People notice more than bullies realize. They just don't usually think anyone will ever ask. The biggest surprise came that evening. My mom knocked on my office door holding her phone. "I think you should have this." I frowned. "What is it?" I started recording after he walked onto the porch. She handed me the phone almost apologetically. "I've learned that people say different things when they think no one will remember." I pressed play. The audio wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Richard's voice came through clearly enough. Every cruel sentence, every dismissive remark, even my request for him to repeat himself. Then his own voice, slower, louder, and somehow even more confident than before. I closed my eyes for a second and almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Years ago, one of my supervisors told me something I'd never forgotten. The most dangerous witness in any discrimination case isn't the investigator. It's the person who thinks nobody's recording. Richard had just become that witness. 3 days later, I filed the federal complaint. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. 43 pages, organized evidence, witness affidavits, supporting documentation, applicable statutes, and a request for immediate review based on disability discrimination. When I hit submit, I didn't feel victorious. I actually felt strangely calm because at that point, the outcome wasn't up to me anymore. The system I had trusted for 11 years would either work or it wouldn't. Weeks passed. Construction stayed frozen. Every morning, my mother still had to wait while I carefully maneuvered her wheelchair over those same dangerous steps. Every time I lifted the chair, she smiled and said, "Still got your muscles?" And every time I answered, "Barely." We joked because it was easier than admitting how exhausting it had become for both of us. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to think my silence meant surrender. At the monthly HOA meeting, he proudly announced that the board had successfully defended neighborhood standards. Several residents even applauded because they had no idea what had actually happened. I sat in the back without saying a word. On my way out, Richard caught up to me in the parking lot. "Looks like you've accepted the decision," he said with that same practiced smile. "Not exactly." "Well, eventually people realized the board always wins." I couldn't help smiling. "Richard, federal investigators really hate hearing that sentence." His smile faded for just a fraction of a second before he laughed it off. "You're bluffing." "Maybe." Then I got in my truck and drove away. About a month later, certified letters started arriving at board members' homes requesting records, meeting minutes, emails, architectural review documents, and internal communications. Suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. Frank called me one evening. "You should have seen the emergency board meeting. They looked like someone had announced a tax audit." Another neighbor texted that Richard had spent nearly an hour insisting the investigation was routine and would be over quickly. But routine investigations don't usually interview contractors, delivery drivers, landscapers, former board members, and residents separately. They especially don't subpoena years of committee records. That's when the pattern started emerging. Investigators discovered my mother's request wasn't unique. An elderly veteran had been denied a handrail because it supposedly changed the appearance of his porch. A woman recovering from a spinal injury had been refused permission to widen her walkway. Another family quietly sold their home after repeated delays involving accessibility modifications for their teenage son. Individually, those incidents looked like isolated disagreements. Together, they painted something much darker, a culture that consistently treated disabled homeowners as inconveniences rather than neighbors. Richard's attorney finally advised him to stop speaking publicly. But men like Richard usually mistake confidence for intelligence. At another meeting, he complained that people abuse disability rules to get special treatment. Someone recorded that meeting too. Then an email surfaced where he joked that ramps were the first step toward turning Cedar Ridge into a retirement village. Every new piece of evidence made the original complaint stronger. 4 months after I submitted the case, my phone buzzed while I was helping Mom plant flowers beside the unfinished concrete footing. The subject line simply read, "Investigation findings available." I stood there staring at the screen while my mother looked at my face and quietly asked, "Is that?" I nodded without speaking. My hands were steady as I opened the email, but my heart wasn't. Attached was a 62-page report. I took one slow breath, opened the first page, and before I even reached the second paragraph, I realized Richard Holloway and the entire HOA board had just lost far more than a simple argument over a wheelchair ramp. I read the report twice before I said a single word. The first time I read it like the former investigator I used to be, looking for weak spots, procedural mistakes, anything the HOA might try to appeal. The second time I read it like a son, and somewhere around page 21, I realized something that hit me harder than I expected. This case had never really been about a wheelchair ramp. It was about dignity. It was about whether someone could look my mother in the eye and decide she belonged somewhere else simply because walking had become impossible. The investigators didn't just disagree with the HOA's decision. They dismantled it piece by piece. The report concluded that the association had failed to provide a reasonable accommodation, relied on discriminatory reasoning, ignored applicable federal protections, and created a documented pattern of denying accessibility requests to disabled residents. Every excuse about neighborhood appearance, every reference to property values, every attempt to hide behind architectural guidelines had collapsed under the weight of their own records. I looked over at Mom. She was watching my face instead of the computer screen because she already knew the answer before I spoke. "We won," I said quietly. She covered her mouth with both hands and started crying. Not loud, dramatic crying. Just the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. A few weeks later, the settlement became official. The HOA agreed to pay $260,000 covering damages, legal costs, and corrective actions. They were required to issue a formal written apology, adopt new accessibility policies, complete mandatory federal fair housing training, and approve the construction of our ramp immediately. But the money wasn't what shook the neighborhood. It was everything that happened afterward. The HOA's insurance carrier conducted its own review after seeing the federal findings. Once they uncovered years of similar complaints and repeated accessibility disputes, they decided the association represented too much risk. They canceled the policy before renewal. Finding replacement coverage wasn't impossible. It was just incredibly expensive. Premiums nearly tripled overnight. Within weeks, the board announced a special assessment for every homeowner to cover the increased insurance costs. Suddenly, the same neighbors who had applauded Richard's speeches started asking uncomfortable questions. How did this happen? Why weren't we told about the investigation? Why are we paying for someone else's arrogance? Those meetings became standing room-only events. I attended exactly one of them. Richard stood at the front of the room trying to blame lawyers, government overreach, changing regulations, anyone except himself. Then an older gentleman stood up from the third row. I recognized him from one of the witness interviews. He leaned on a cane and spoke calmly. My wife asked for a handrail 3 years ago. You denied it. Another resident raised her hand. You delayed my sister's accessibility request until she sold her house. Then another and another. Stories started pouring out from every corner of the room. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly realized they hadn't been alone. Richard kept trying to interrupt, but nobody was listening anymore. 3 weeks later, the community voted to remove him as HOA president. It wasn't even close. Several other board members resigned before the vote finished because they knew what was coming. His real estate license was placed under formal review after complaints referencing the federal findings were submitted to the licensing board. Whether he kept it or not was no longer my concern. My concern was sitting beside me in the truck on a bright Tuesday morning while construction crews tightened the final bolts on a brand new wheelchair ramp. Mike walked over, wiped the dust from his hands, and smiled. Want to do the honors? I nodded, rolled my mother's wheelchair toward the front door, and for the first time since I'd moved home, I didn't have to stop at the steps. She eased forward slowly, sunlight warming her face, the wheels gliding down the ramp so smoothly it almost looked effortless. Halfway to the driveway, she stopped, looked back at the front door, then looked at me with a smile I'd honestly forgotten she still had. You know what? She said. For the first time in years, this actually feels like my house again. I laughed because if I hadn't, I probably would have cried with her. We sat outside for almost an hour that afternoon doing absolutely nothing except watching neighbors walk by. Something unexpected happened. One by one, people stopped to apologize. Some admitted they never questioned the board because they assumed the board knew the law. Others confessed they stayed silent because they didn't want to become the next target. I didn't hold grudges against most of them. Fear has a way of making decent people look away. But silence also has consequences, and that's the lesson I hope more communities learn before someone else has to fight the battle we fought. Looking back now, I don't think Richard woke up one morning determined to discriminate against a disabled woman. I think power slowly convinced him that rules existed to protect his authority instead of people's rights. That's a far more dangerous mindset, because it grows quietly until someone finally says, enough. Our ramp still stands today. It's probably the least interesting thing you'll notice if you drive past the house. But to me, it's a daily reminder that compassion should never need a legal brief to win. Sometimes people ask whether all the stress, the hearings, the paperwork, and the months of uncertainty were worth it. My answer is always the same. The moment my mother rolled out the front door without asking me to lift her wheelchair, every late night, every document, every difficult conversation became worth it. Money comes and goes. Board members get replaced. Neighborhood politics fade. But giving someone back a little piece of their independence, that's something no settlement check can measure. Now I'm curious what you think. Was Richard simply enforcing rules the way he believed he should? Or did he cross a line the moment he decided appearances mattered more than a person's dignity? Have you ever lived under an HOA that forgot why communities exist in the first place? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd really like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life community justice stories, and I'll see you in the next one.